We now turn to look at inductive arguments again. As we saw before, an inductive argument is an argument in which the premises are intended to provide some degree of support for the conclusion, but less than complete support. Inductive arguments deal in probability, so that with an inductive argument, the premises are given as evidence or reason that the conclusion is likely or probably true. The conclusion goes beyond the evidence presented in the premises. This is referred to as the inductive leap. Now, the inductive leap, roughly put, and sometimes referred to as the problem of induction, is this. When making an inductive argument, you go from what you've observed or what you know, which is presented in the premises, and you leap beyond that to an inference that's presented in the conclusion. To give kind of a pretty straightforward example of this, consider how surveys or polls are conducted. Suppose that CNN or MSNBC or Fox wants to know what Americans think about a particular issue. Let's say gun control, stronger gun control laws. Now, obviously, they're not going to have the time or resources to go and ask millions of Americans what they think about this. What they'll probably do is conduct a poll or survey, perhaps involving at most 1,000 or 1,500 people. And then they get the results. Now suppose they go and conduct this survey or poll and they find that 53% of Americans favor stronger restrictions on gun ownership. And what they would do, of course, is draw the conclusion that given that in the premise, 53% of Americans, in the survey claim to favor gun control, that 53% of Americans in general, and of course in a survey they'll typically put up a margin of error, have that particular view. Now, of course, there's a leap here, because the conclusion about what all Americans think is based on a sample of a relatively small number of Americans, and so there's a leap. And of course, the information gained in the survey could be completely accurate, but when you extend that to the whole population, there's always a possibility that things could go wrong. So even though the survey was well taken, perhaps it doesn't represent, the whole population. So in a case in inductive arguments, there's always that risk. Now, in terms of assessing inductive arguments, they're assessed in terms of how well, how strongly, how effectively the evidence or reasons, the premises, support the conclusion. Now, generally, just like any argument, the overall sort of assessment is how strong is the logic? That is to say, how well does the evidence presented in the premises support the conclusion? Now, unlike deductive arguments, which can be tested for validity or invalidity with things like truth tables, Venn diagrams, proofs, inductive arguments, unfortunately, of the sort we're looking at, don't have those precise, exact methods. So, in the case of inductive arguments, what's typically done is there's a set of standards for each argument individually that is applied to that argument. And if it meets the standards, to the degree that it meets them, the argument is good or strong. To the degree that it fails to meet them or meets them weakly, it becomes obviously weak. And so assessing inductive arguments, I used this analogy before, is somewhat like assessing, say, Olympic diving, in the sense that, there are clear standards by which to judge the performance of the argument, but it's not as exact or precise or objective as, say, judging the winner in a mile race or a 5K, because in the case of a race, it's simply a matter of who gets across the finish line first, meeting all the other conditions as well. So it's pretty objective. You can just have a picture that tells you who won. Whereas in the case of say diving, there's a degree of subjectivity. You take the standards or assess the event and apply it to it. And inductive arguments are rather like that. They have clear standards, but people can disagree reasonably about how well an inductive argument meets those standards or not. Now, as I mentioned before, inductive arguments that are good, that is to say, if the premises were true, the conclusion would probably be true, are known as strong. Those in which the truth of the premises only makes it not very likely for the conclusion to be true, those would be weak. Now, strong and weak are relative, Now, unlike being valid or invalid, which is absolute, an argument, a deductive argument, either is valid or invalid. There's no gray, and it's one or the other. With inductive arguments, though, there's a relative degrees of strength. Essentially, an argument could be, very strong, strong, weak, very weak, horribly weak, average, etc. And unfortunately, there's no exact cutoff point in terms of what exactly counts as strong. What's the exact, cutoff point between strong and weak? And there's a degree of fuzziness there as well. So inductive arguments, sort of as a downside, there's not these perfectly objective ways of testing them. Of course, there's not an absolute distinction between, good and bad inductive arguments, and it's kind of fuzzy. But, as we'll see, they're very useful, and so part of the price we pay for their usefulness are those weak points. And what we'll turn to next is looking at particular types of inductive arguments. Specifically, we'll look at three general ones: the analogical argument, the argument from or by example, and lastly, of the three generic inductive arguments, the argument from authorité.